Zeke Callahan never imagined that day in the small town of Mineral Springs would forever change the course of his life. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the main street as Zeke rode in, shoulders tense like he was carrying an invisible burden. His mother, Lorna Callahan, the only bloodkin he had left, had been bedridden at the ranch for weeks. For nearly a month, Zeke had asked for help without luck. No one in town was willing to go that far, so far beyond the comfort of the world they knew. He brought his horse to a stop in front of the general store. There, a group of women stood whispering quietly around a lone figure. It was an Apache woman, her face completely hidden beneath a dark veil. She wore a plain dress, clean despite the dust of the road, and held a small handwritten sign in Spanish. "Looking for work. I can cook and care for the sick." "She must be awful looking under that veil," Clara Vance murmured to her neighbor. "That's why she covers herself, so no one has to see her." "Apaches can't be trusted," added another woman. "She'd probably rob us in our sleep." Zeke watched as the veiled woman went from door to door. She knocked gently, waited a few seconds, and always received the same answer. Doors closing in her face. No yelling, no insults. Just the dry, final sound of wood shutting her out. There was something in the way she walked, the quiet dignity with which she held her head high despite the rejection, that stirred something deep in Zeke. He knew that kind of loneliness, that silent despair that never begs for pity. He stepped forward just as the woman turned away from the last house on the street. She froze at the sound of his approach, clutching the sign in both hands. "Ma'am," Zeke said, removing his hat respectfully. "My mother is real sick back at my ranch. She needs constant care, slow-cooked meals, and someone to keep the house running. It's hard work, and the ranch is 2 hours from here. Would you be interested?" The woman looked at him through the veil in long silence. Zeke couldn't see her eyes, but he felt the weight of her gaze, like she was measuring him from the inside out. Finally, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The pay's fair," Zeke went on. "You'll have your own room, 3 meals a day, and $10 a week. More than what they'd offer here." Another nod. "What's your name?" he asked. There was a long pause. Then, in a low voice, soft as the wind through mesquite branches, she answered, "Ada." It was the first time she'd spoken. Her accent held a strange musicality, a blend of Spanish and something older, deeper. A shiver ran down Zeke's spine, though he couldn't explain why. "Welcome, Ada. I'm Zeke Callahan. We can leave right now if you're ready." She pointed to a small cloth bag leaning against the store wall. That was all she owned. Zeke picked it up, tied it to his saddle, and helped her mount. Ada sat with the ease of someone used to riding, her veil and dress flowing naturally with the horse's rhythm. As they left the town behind, Zeke noticed the disapproving stares. Clara Vance shook her head. Roy Cutter spat on the ground as they passed. Zeke didn't answer any of it. He kept his eyes on the open horizon, where the ranch awaited. The road to Los Alamos was long and dusty. For the first hour, they didn't speak a word. Zeke respected Ada's silence, sensing there were deep reasons behind it. The landscape stretched before them, hills of dry grass, twisted mesquite trees offering little shade, and far off, the purple mountains marking Apache land. When the sun began to dip westward, Zeke finally broke the silence. "My mother's name is Lorna. She's a good woman. Just real weak now. Been 3 months since she could get out of bed. The town doctor, Silas Grubb, says she needs steady care and good meals. He paused, voice thick with exhaustion. "I ain't much of a cook, and the ranch don't run itself. I've tried to keep it going, but I'm losing her." Ada turned her head just slightly. though the veil still hid her expression. "I'll care for her," she said. Nothing more. Nothing else needed. They arrived at the ranch just as the sky burned orange and purple. The house was modest but solid, built of good timber, with a wide porch, well-kept corrals, and a barn that had seen better days. It wasn't much, but it was honest, raised with Zeke's own sweat. Lorna Callahan was awake when they stepped inside. Around 60, her gray hair was tied back, and her blue eyes had dulled from illness. At the sight of Ada in the veil, she looked surprised, but her expression soon softened. "Mama, this is Ada," Zeke said. "She's come to help us." Ada stepped forward with quiet, measured steps, knelt beside the bed, and gently took Lorna's hand in hers. Though she couldn't see her face, Lorna felt the warmth in that simple gesture. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. "We truly needed help." Ada gave her hand a soft squeeze, then stood and walked to the kitchen without saying a word. Within the hour, the scent of fresh broth filled the house, a smell that hadn't been there in months. That night, as Zeke helped his mother sip the warm broth, Lorna looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Son, you brought an angel into this house." Zeke glanced toward the kitchen, where Ada moved quietly, cloaked in shadows. He didn't know if she was an angel, but there was something different about her, something that went beyond the veil, and deep in his chest, he felt his life had just begun to change. Days at the Los Alamos ranch began to find a new rhythm. Every morning, before the sun even brushed gold across the sky, Ada was already awake. Zeke could hear her moving through the kitchen, her footsteps so light they barely touched the floor. The change came quick. In just a week, the windows gleamed, the curtains were mended, and the scent of fresh bread replaced the dust and neglect. But the most remarkable shift was in Lorna herself. She could now sit up for meals, the color returned to her cheeks, and her eyes began to shine again with life. Ada made her healing broths with herbs gathered from the hills, brewed fragrant teas that eased pain, and prepared soft meals Lorna could eat without trouble. "Your Ada is a miracle," Lorna told Zeke one afternoon. "She's got healer's hands. You can feel it the moment she touches you." Zeke had noticed it, too. Ada's hands, her only visible feature beneath the sleeves of her dress, were slender yet steady. Not hands hardened by field work, but hands made for care. Each evening, once Lorna was resting and the house was in order, Ada would disappear for about an hour. Zeke would see her walking up the hill behind the ranch, her dark silhouette outlined against the endless Texas sky. Every time the day ended and the crickets began to sing, Ada Redhawk climbed that hill alone. She always sat on the same large stone, gazing eastward, where distant mountains turned blue and held the memories of her homeland. One afternoon, driven by a restless pull inside him, Zeke Callahan followed her, from a distance. He didn't speak. He simply stood at the base of the hill, watching her still figure, like a piece of the landscape itself, her veil shifting gently in the breeze. He didn't know what she was searching for up there. Maybe something lost, maybe something she still longed for. But he didn't disturb her. Some silences, he knew, were more sacred than company. As the days passed, Ada began to speak more. Her Spanish was smooth, nearly perfect, but it carried an accent that felt like it came from another time. Now and then, she would let slip words from her Apache tongue, phrases that sounded like old verses, filled with rhythm and music. "The horses are restless," she said one morning as Zeke got ready to check the fence lines. "How can you tell?" he asked, raising a brow. "I hear them," she said calmly. "They speak, if you know how to listen." Zeke headed to the barn, And to his surprise, she was right. One horse had a stone lodged in its hoof, and another was starting to show early signs of colic. Another day, as they both worked in the garden Ada had started behind the house, she looked to the horizon and pointed to a thin line of clouds barely visible. "It'll rain in 2 days," she said with certainty. Zeke glanced up at the sky, clear and blue with no cloud in sight. He hesitated. But 2 days later, a spring storm drenched the dry land like it had been called by her own breath. "How did you know?" he asked after the rain passed. "My grandfather taught me to read the sky," she replied simply. "The earth always speaks, but not everyone knows how to listen." Each day, Zeke found himself more drawn to her, not just for the way she cared for Lorna or how she kept the house in order, but for the way she moved through the world, as though she belonged more to the land than to the people on it. Even the birds seemed unafraid to come close when Ada worked among the flowers. One afternoon, as Zeke was fixing a porch rail and Ada was watering the plants, he finally gathered the courage to ask what had always been on his mind. "Ada, why the veil?" His voice was soft, without judgment. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to," he added. "But I've always wondered why someone as strong as you would choose to hide from the world." Ada went still. The watering can in her hands hung mid-air. Water trickled silently onto the soil. She didn't respond right away. Zeke felt a pang, like maybe he'd crossed a line, maybe broken something fragile. Then, at last, she spoke. "Someday," she said. "I'll tell you, but not yet. Not now." Zeke nodded without pressing her. "All right, whenever you're ready." That night, once Lorna Callahan was asleep, and the house had fallen into stillness, Zeke stepped out onto the porch. He sat and looked up at the stars like he used to do as a boy. He heard the door open gently. It was Ada. She took a seat at the far end of the porch, keeping a respectful distance between them. "My mother's getting better because of you," he said without looking at her. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," she replied. "You gave me shelter when everyone else turned their backs. You treated me with respect when all others saw was fear." "Then the others are fools," Zeke said firmly. "Anyone with eyes can see your worth." "Not everyone wants to see," Ada murmured. "They only see the veil. It's easier to judge than to understand." "Then they're doubly foolish," he answered. For the first time, Ada let out a soft laugh, like little bells dancing in the wind. Zeke felt his heart leap in his chest. "You're a good man, Zeke Callahan. Your mother raised you with wisdom." "She's all I have," he said, his throat tightening. "When my father passed 5 years ago, I thought I'd lose her too. But she's strong, stronger than she looks." "Strength isn't always measured in muscle," Ada said. "Sometimes it's in a heart that keeps beating even when it's broken." They sat in silence after that. Only the crickets and the wind through the mesquite trees kept them company. In that moment, Zeke understood something deep. He didn't need to see Ada's face to know her. He already did, through her hands, her words, her spirit. And yet, deep inside, he still wondered what that veil was hiding. What story had led her to shut herself off from the world? Summer arrived in full force, with its brutal weight. Long days, heavy nights. But on the Los Alamos ranch, life had found a new rhythm. Lorna now walked through the house with the help of a cane. Her health was slowly returning, thanks to Ada's tireless care. Zeke had grown used to her quiet presence, to the sound of her soft steps across the wood floor, to finding her every morning with breakfast already made. The veil had stopped being strange. It was simply part of her, like her calm voice or the way she understood the land. But everything changed one night in August. The sky turned black like ash. The air grew thick, as if the world were holding its breath. Zeke was in the barn when he saw the clouds twisting angrily in the west. This wasn't just any storm. It was the kind that ripped up trees and tore roofs off homes. "Storm's coming!" he shouted, running toward the house. "Ada, shut all the windows!" But Ada was already moving fast. She had bolted the shutters and was helping Lorna to the interior room, the safest one in the house. "The horses," she said urgently. "They're scared. I can hear them." Zeke cursed under his breath. In the rush, he'd forgotten to properly secure the barn. If the horses broke loose, they could be lost, or worse. "Stay with Mama," he yelled as he ran back out. But Ada didn't stay. Once she was sure Lorna was safe, she went after him, pushing through wind that already roared like a wild beast. Inside the barn, Zeke's 5 horses were panicked. A young colt, Thunder, had broken loose and was kicking the walls with fury. The others were rearing and snorting, blinded by fear. "Easy now, boy. Easy," Zeke murmured, trying to get close without being trampled. Then Ada stepped in. She walked straight toward the colt. Her voice began to flow in Apache, like an old lullaby. It was incredible. But Thunder calmed down. He twitched his ears toward her, lowered his head, and let her touch his muzzle. Ada led him back to his stall. Then she moved from one horse to the next, speaking in that same soft, firm, ancient tone. Within minutes, all the horses were calm, while outside, the storm raged on. And then, the unexpected happened. A violent gust slammed into the barn. The roof groaned, and a beam gave way. The timber cracked with a dry moan, and suddenly a heavy beam dropped from the ceiling, crashing down dangerously close to Ada Redhawk. Zeke Callahan didn't think. He just moved. He lunged, pushing her out of the way. They both rolled across the straw-covered floor, and in that very instant, a fierce gust tore through the barn and ripped the veil from Ada's face. The world seemed to stop. Zeke looked at her, and the air caught in his chest. Ada wasn't just beautiful. She was something beyond what words could easily explain. Her face held the harmony of something ancient. High, defined cheekbones, a delicate nose, full and soft lips, and skin the color of polished bronze, glowing faintly in the light. But it was her eyes that left him frozen. Large and deep, a dark shade of brown streaked with gold, framed by long lashes that trembled with fear. Her black hair, now loose at last, fell in waves over her shoulders like a knight set free. It wasn't a face meant to be hidden. It was the kind of face painters would chase for years, one poets would try to capture and never succeed. A beauty that made the heart stop, and then beat even harder. Ada froze. Panic swept through her eyes. She lifted her hands to her face, desperately searching for the veil among the damp straw. The tears started to fall uncontrollably. "No, don't look, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. Zeke blinked, shaken out of his trance. He saw the terror in her eyes, and something inside him cracked. Without thinking, he shut his eyes tight and turned his head away. "I didn't see anything," he said firmly. "I didn't see a thing, Ada, I promise." "You're lying," she sobbed. "You saw me. That's how it always goes. Everyone looks, and then everything changes." Zeke kept his eyes closed with a painful kind of resolve. The image of her face was etched in his memory forever, but he would never use it against her. "I'm going to find your veil," he said. "Stay right there." Feeling around blindly, eyes still shut, he began to search through the straw, the broken boards, and the dust. His hands moved across the ground until, at last, he touched the soft fabric. He picked it up gently and held it out to her, without looking. Here. And believe me when I say this, he added in a low voice. You have nothing to be ashamed of. But I'll respect your choice. That's yours to make, not mine. Ada took the veil with trembling hands and put it back on at once. The barn still shook with the wind, but the worst of the storm seemed to have passed. They sat there in the straw, barely a yard apart, and yet separated by an invisible canyon. Why? Ada asked at last, her voice muffled behind the veil. Why did you close your eyes? Zeke opened his eyes slowly, but kept his gaze fixed on the barn door. Because I saw your fear, he answered, and because what someone chooses to keep private deserves respect, whatever the reason. But you saw my face. I saw a woman who was scared and needed help, Zeke corrected her. That's all. The rest, I'll forget. He knew it wasn't true. He would never forget what he had seen, but he would do everything he could to keep that promise and honor the boundaries Ada had drawn. The days after the storm felt strange. Quiet. Ada went on with her work, caring for Lorna Callahan and keeping the house in order. But something had shifted. They no longer sat together on the porch at night. When they passed each other in the house, Ada lowered her eyes and walked away quickly. Zeke respected the space, even though it stung. He kept his word and never brought up what had happened in the barn. Even though her face haunted his dreams, Lorna, on the other hand, noticed everything. One afternoon, after Ada had gone out toward the hill, she called her son into the room. What happened between you two? She asked bluntly, the way only a mother can. Nothing, Mama, Zeke lied. Zeke Callahan, I've known you since the day you were born. Don't lie to me. Her eyes, now much livelier than when Ada had first come to the ranch, stared straight through him. That girl is hurting, and so are you. Zeke sighed and sat down beside the bed. He told her everything. The storm, the barn, the veil torn away by the wind, and how he had shut his eyes to protect her. When he finished, Lorna was crying quietly. My son, raising you right was the best thing I ever did in this life, she said at last. But now it's time for you to go further. She needs to know she can trust someone, that your respect has no conditions. I've given her space, Zeke replied. I thought that's what she wanted. It's not space she needs, Lorna corrected. She needs to know you expect nothing in return. Go, talk to her, and let her know that when she's ready, you'll be there to listen, without judgment. That very afternoon, when Ada returned from the hill, Zeke was waiting on the porch. She stopped when she saw him, ready to walk around the house. Ada, please, he said gently. I just want to talk. She hesitated, but finally stepped up the porch stairs and sat on the far end, like before. I'm sorry if I made you feel uncomfortable these past days, Zeke began. I thought you needed distance, but now I understand maybe what you really need is to know nothing's changed. You're still welcome here. You're still respected. And whenever you want to talk, I'll be here. Ada said nothing. The sun was sinking into the horizon, painting the sky in orange and violet. Did you really close your eyes? She asked at last. Yes. Why? Because everyone always wants to look, Zeke answered. Because your fear was real. And because no one has the right to take from you what you choose to keep private. Or not. Another long silence. Then, with a trembling voice, Ada began to speak. I was born in the eastern mountains, in an Apache camp. My father, Bram Redhawk, was the clan chief. My mother died when I was little, and my grandmother, Ayla Redhawk, raised me. Zeke listened without a word, his heart tightening with every sentence. When I turned 15, everything changed. Men started looking at me differently. 3 warriors, Creed Voss, Judd Sloan, and Dax Mercer, wanted to marry me. My father thought he could use that to build alliances, but he was wrong." Her voice turned sharper. "Families divided. Brothers turned on each other. The camp I grew up in started to fall apart." Ada lowered her head. "I heard the elders say my beauty was a curse, that I was tearing our people apart. And every time I stepped out of my tent, I saw it. Hatred, jealousy, greed." The silence between them grew heavy as dusk settled. She hadn't been a person to them. She had become a symbol, a poisoned prize, a flame that brought nothing but envy and war. "So you ran," Zeke Callahan said quietly, more a breath than a question. "I took my grandmother Ayla Redhawk's mourning veil, the woman who raised me," Ada replied. "I told my father I was going to visit a cousin, Tessa Vale, in another camp. But instead I walked south. I was looking for a place where I could just be myself, not looked at, not fought over." "You thought that if no one saw you, no one would try to claim you," Zeke murmured. "And in town, they rejected me for the opposite reason," Ada added with a sad half-laugh. "They thought I must be ugly beneath the veil." "Cruel irony," he said, "but at least they didn't covet you." "Rejection hurts, but less than greed. I'd rather be invisible than be seen as a curse." "You are not a curse, Ada," he said firmly. "The curse was what those men did. Their pride, their ambition, not your face." "But my face was the spark that lit it all." "No, your face is yours alone. What they did because they lacked honor. A real man doesn't fight over a woman like she's cattle. He respects her, or he loses her." Ada turned slightly toward him, the veil still covering her face. "When you saw me that night, what did you feel?" Zeke swallowed. He knew his words had to come from the soul. "Surprise," he admitted. "Not because of what I saw, but because what I'd imagined never came close to the truth. But more than anything, I felt your fear, and that fear mattered more to me than any beauty." Her voice trembled slightly. "Now that I know why you hide, I see you braver than ever." Ada lowered her head. Silent tears began to soak the dark veil. "No one ever said it that way. They always thought my running was weakness." "Then they were all wrong." The following weeks brought a new light to the Los Alamos ranch. The distance between them melted like morning fog under the Texas sun. Speaking had given Ada an invisible freedom, one that didn't show in words, but in the lighter way she walked, in how her voice became more present. Lorna Callahan continued to improve. She now walked without her cane, and sometimes helped Ada in the kitchen, peeling vegetables or kneading dough. The two women had forged a quiet bond, one of those that didn't need many words, just looks, small gestures. One morning, Zeke was fixing a broken fence when he saw her in the garden she'd planted herself. The patch was overflowing. Tomatoes red as fire, squash, herbs she used both for cooking and her healing teas. Butterflies danced between the flowers, and the birds seemed to sing just for her. He set his tools aside and walked over. "Ada," he called softly, "can I talk to you?" She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. Though she still wore the veil, there was a peace in her movements that hadn't been there before. "Of course, Zeke. Is something wrong?" "Nothing bad," he clarified quickly. "Quite the opposite. I wanted to thank you. Not just for taking care of my mother, which is already more than anyone could ask, but for bringing life back to this place." "This ranch gave me shelter," she answered, lowering her head slightly, as if smiling behind the veil. "I only did what I had to." "No, you did far more," he insisted. "You transformed this place, and I want you to know this is your home too, not just as a worker, as part of us. If someday you choose to leave, I'll understand. But if you choose to stay, there'll always be a place here for you." Ada looked as though she might reply. But a voice called out from the house. "Zeke! Ada, come quick!" Lorna shouted from the parlor. They both rushed in, fearing the worst. But when they entered, they found her standing by the window, her face serious. "Riders are coming," she said, pointing toward the horizon. "A lot of them, and they're not neighbor cowboys." Zeke looked out the window. His stomach dropped. A cloud of dust was rising in the distance, and through it, Apache riders advanced at a steady pace. At least 10 of them. At the front rode an older man, upright in posture, his face weathered by time. At his sides, young warriors with hard eyes. Ada stepped closer to the window. At the sight, a broken sound escaped her lips. "My father," she whispered. "He found me." Zeke felt a wave of protectiveness and anger. He turned toward her. "Do you want me to handle it? Tell them you're not here?" Ada shook her head slowly. "I've run enough. It's time to look back without fear." All 3 stepped out onto the porch. The riders pulled up just a few paces away. The horses snorted, stomping the earth with force. The older man dismounted with the grace of someone who'd spent his whole life in the saddle. His eyes, the same golden shade as Ada's, swept across the scene until they landed on the veiled figure of his daughter. "Ada," he said in Apache, his voice deep, "I have crossed many moons searching for you." "Father," she replied in the same language, then switched to Spanish out of respect for the others present. "How did you find me?" "A daughter cannot hide from her father forever," he answered. "The traders, Hank Dobbs among them, spoke of an Apache woman with a veil working on this ranch." One of the young warriors, tall, with scars marking his arms, stepped forward. "You brought shame to the clan," he said harshly. "You ran instead of fulfilling your duty." Zeke stepped forward without thinking, placing himself between Ada and the visitor. "That's not how we speak here," he said firmly. "This is my land, and on it no one insults those I call family." Ada's father looked at him with renewed interest. "Family," the elder repeated. "This white man calls you family, my daughter." "Yes," Ada replied, stepping closer to Zeke. "He and his mother gave me shelter, treated me with respect. Here, I found something I had lost back home. Peace." The old man raised his hand, stopping his warriors from responding. He walked slowly until he stood in front of her. "You're right," he said at last. "What happened was our fault. We've had many moons to think it over." "We watched the camp split in 2, said Bram Redhawk, his voice heavy with memory. "Brothers turning on one another. It took time, but we finally understood. It wasn't you who brought the curse, my daughter. It was our failure to control the greed in our own hearts." Beneath the veil, Ada Redhawk's tears began to fall freely. "Father, after I left, things only got worse. Creed Voss, Judd Sloan, and Dax Mercer nearly dragged us into civil war." The elder nodded, filled with regret. "The council finally acted. We cast all 3 out, declared that their ambition and lack of honor had no place among us, and without them, peace returned. I came here to ask your forgiveness, Ada. We failed you. We allowed the selfishness of a few to make you feel like a burden, when you should have been honored as the gift you are." Ada placed both hands over her heart, crying silently. Zeke Callahan placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture that said everything without a single word. "Father, I'm sorry too," she whispered. "I should have spoken with you before I ran, but I was afraid." Bram opened his arms. His silhouette, still dignified despite the years, seemed more human now. "Come home, daughter. Your clan misses you. Your family needs you." A silence stretched between them like a taut string. Ada looked at him, then turned her gaze toward the porch, where Zeke and Lorna Callahan waited. Her eyes settled on Zeke's. He didn't need to speak. She felt it in her chest. "Ada," Zeke said softly, "this choice is yours alone. If you want to go with your father, I'll understand. But if you want to stay, I'll fight for you. What matters is what your heart says." She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice no longer trembled. "Father, I love our people. I love the mountains where I was born. But here I found something I never had there. Freedom. The freedom to be just Ada, not an offering, not a burden, just myself." Then, hands shaking, she reached up to her veil. The warriors began to murmur, and Bram Redhawk stepped back. But Ada did not stop. Slowly she pulled away the cloth that had hidden her face for years. The Texas sun kissed her skin. Her beauty was as striking as the first time Zeke had seen it. But now it carried something more. Strength, certainty, peace. "This is my face," she said, looking straight ahead. "I won't hide it out of shame or fear anymore. And if I ever return to the clan, it will be like this, just as I am. No masks, no shame." Her father studied her for a long moment. And then he smiled. Not quickly, not theatrically. A real smile, forged from years of pain and reflection. That is my daughter," he said with pride. "The brave one I always knew you were." Ada turned toward Zeke. Her eyes, now unveiled, shimmered with emotion. He stepped forward and took her hand, gently, with care. "Are you sure?" "More than I've ever been in my life." Bram watched the scene unfold. His gaze softened. He gave a slow nod. "I see now. You've found your path. And I see this man looks at you the way a woman ought to be seen, for who you are, not how you appear. That's rare and precious." He stepped toward Zeke and extended his hand in a gesture of respect. "Take good care of her, Zeke Callahan. And you, Ada, you'll always have a place back home, if ever you wish to return." "Thank you, Father," Ada said, wrapping him in a strong embrace. "I'll come visit soon. But this ranch, this family, this is where I belong now." The Apache riders departed at sunset, fading into golden dust and warm evening light. From the porch, Ada, Zeke, and Lorna watched them disappear between the hills. "Well then," Lorna said with a sly smile, "I suppose it's time we start planning a wedding." Ada let out a clear, bright, musical laugh. And for the first time, Zeke saw that joy on her face with no veil in between. It was the laughter of someone truly free. As the sun dipped behind the barn, painting the sky in amber and crimson, Zeke took her hand with steady purpose. There was no veil between them now, only the open air, the living land, and a promise spoken without words, the promise of a future built on respect, on understanding, and on a love that asked for nothing but to be shared. Up on the hill where Ada once sat alone, looking toward her past, she now saw only one thing: tomorrow. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to stay with us and discover more true-to-the-spirit tales of the Old West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the soul God placed in those who paved the way. Subscribe, share, leave a comment, and ride with us again through this untamed land. Thank you.